this session, we're looking at the spiritual gifts. We primarily focusing on the passage in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14. 1 Corinthians 12 verse 1 says, "Now about the spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed." Now that's exactly why we are on this course. We want to learn, we want to be hungry for them, get activated, learn how to recognize them, become mature in operating in them. So what are they? Well, if we go on to verse 7 of the passage, it says, "Now to each one of you, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good." The manifestation of the Spirit. The manifestation of God's Spirit here on earth through us is exactly what the spiritual gifts are. We know we are in God. Earlier in Corinthians chapter 6, verse 7, it says, "But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit." So as one with the Godhead, as one, we can only expect that as believers who have got restored relationship with him, that he would flow through us, that his character and all who he is will manifest and flow right out of us. So we have this list of the spiritual gifts if we look in verses 8 to 10. And this list of the spiritual gifts is a list that is not necessarily exclusive, but exemplary of what the gifts are. We know God is outside of the box, so of course he can manifest himself in many more ways. Now, the context of this passage is really explaining to the church that it's not one spirit for this and one spirit for this gift, but it's the same spirit, the same God for all of the gifts. What we can take from this is a list of how we can recognize and really learn primarily how God operates through us and in us. So here they are. We look at verse 8. "To one there is given through the Spirit a message of wisdom, to another a message of knowledge by means of the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by that one Spirit, to another miraculous powers, to another prophecy, to another distinguishing between the spirits, to another speaking in different kinds of tongues, and still to another the interpretation of tongues." Now, to make that simpler, we can basically break them down into 9 different gifts separated into 3 categories. So you're going to see on the screen here a table of them. Now, this is taken from Mark Verkler. And so it's broken down into 3 parts. We've got the speaking gifts. And this is where the Spirit communicates freely to edify, to exhort, and comfort. And in the speaking gifts, we have tongues, where it is our spirit speaking a language that we didn't learn with our rational minds. We've got the interpretation of tongues. That's interpreting a message given in tongues. And we're going to be focusing later on these gifts. We've got the prophetic, prophecy, God's thought for the moment or for the future. Then we've got the revelation gifts. And this is the Spirit revealing information and insight on properly utilizing the information. So in this, we've got discerning spirits. And that is the immediate inner awareness of the presence of a spiritual force. Now, you may be aware of this when walking into an environment and just sensing something a little bit different. Or maybe it is that someone seems to be saying all the right things, but inside it just feels that something's not quite right. Examples in the Bible of this, Jesus shows it clearly often when he's been talking or listening with the Pharisees, and he says that there's an awareness in the spirit that their reasonings were different in their heart. You can see that in Mark chapter 2, verse 8. Or there's an example with Paul in Acts chapter 16, verses 17 and 18, where there's a servant girl who is got this gift of fortune telling, and she's following Paul around, proclaiming that These men are servants of a living God who are telling you how to be saved. Well, in one sense, that's awesome. But we know that Paul became very annoyed and cast out that spirit because it was a spirit operating, not of God's spirit. And so one of the gifts here is being able to discern. Another revelatory gift is the word of wisdom. And this is a piece of God's wisdom. And you may be aware of this when there's something just kind of drops into you that gives you a solution to something. Maybe it's a solution to a problem, or as you're advising someone about a relationship or how to do something or how to fix something. We see this in the Bible that Jesus operates in so much wisdom all the time. We've got the example about the taxes when he's saying, well, pay to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And we see, again, Paul operate in this. In Ephesians 3, verse 3, there's a part which says, the mystery made known by revelation of the gospel to the Gentiles, but they're part of the body. So that whole kind of change in everything the Jews have been taught about the Jewish people being separate from the Gentiles, that God drops into Paul by revelation that actually, through Jesus, they are part of the body of Christ also. And finally, in the revelatory gifts, we've got word of knowledge. And this is a piece of God's knowledge. We saw that operate when we talked about healing, when we initially kind of asked people to hear a word of knowledge. And we had the word of eyes. And then we saw an eye being healed of pain. We had a word of a wrist that had been hurt by falling on the ice. And the person was able to identify with that. And so that is something about a situation, circumstance. So that might be a word about something that needs healing. It might be details and someone likes just to really highlight them or what God is doing. Maybe it could be their name, address, something about their family, their context. And then we've got the power gifts. And this is the Spirit's power flowing freely as he deposits faith into one's heart and ministers healing and miracles. And so we've got the gift of faith. That's an instantaneous welling up of faith within. Now, obviously, our journey with God is all about faith, but our faith is constantly growing. But the gift of faith is where it literally drops in instantaneous for a certain task, for a certain moment. Healing, wisdom and anointing to provide a specific breakthrough in healing. And miracles, an instantaneous release of divine energy producing an immediate change. And this is when something just completely out of the ordinary and out of the natural happens. Maybe there's a multiplication of food. Maybe it's when we hear the stories of where there's been maybe an accident and somebody has literally found themselves on the other side of the road, totally unhurt. So who are these gifts for? Well, they're for all of us as God's people. 1 Corinthians 12:11 says, all of these are the work of one and the same Spirit. He distributes them to each one just as he determines. So the gifts are given for the common good. They're there to expand the kingdom, to build up the body. And so we know they're far more about God and his purposes than us. However, we are directly invited into the process and we're told to eagerly desire those greater gifts, the gifts of the prophetic, the gifts of faith, to build up his body and see the kingdom expanded. So eagerly desire the gifts. So as one with him, the gifts being a manifestation of who God is, we can expect in all different contexts to manifest those gifts, to manifest many of those gifts or even all of those gifts. The key to operating surely has to be our openness to them, our willingness, our hunger, and the knowing how to recognize and therefore use them. The Bible tells us to fan into flame. 2 Timothy 1 verse 6 says, for this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of hands. It goes on to say, for the Spirit of God does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. And so we're called to fan those gifts into flame, to stir them up. So how do we do that? Well, which gifts are in me? Can it be all of them? If our job is simply to activate them. So we might be looking at the gifts inside of us more a matter of perceiving what is in there rather than simply just receiving them. If we've asked for them, if we've been eagerly desiring them, then maybe our job is more to choose to believe we've got them and to start to activate them, start to operate in them. And so we start to operate in them by not kind of basing it on a feeling, not basing it on, needing that word to be called out that we've got them, but by making that decision, I'm going to believe and I'm going to start to act. Sometimes we can just want to wait instead of get going. So how do we do that? Well, I use an example for me with the prophetic, particularly the word of knowledge. So back in my very, very early 20s, I suddenly realized from seeing the people operate around me and the messages I was hearing that God wants to speak to us and God can speak to us and I can hear him. Now, I personally struggle to kind of reason with that. Can I really hear him? Because does God really want to speak to me? But I had to make that choice to believe that he was going to speak to me, that I'd asked him for that gift. And so what I did was made that decision to choose to believe, even though I didn't necessarily feel it, and then put myself around people operating in it. So at that time, that looked like the pre-service prayers. And in that group were people like way older than me and very mature in their gifting. And so I would listen to them kind of call out words of knowledge of what God was wanting to heal through that service. Now, to start with, I was a bit timid, so I went on the journey of simply just kind of asking God what he was going to do, but I didn't dare speak out. But as I listened to people speak things out, I realized that they were getting the same as me. And so I got a bit bolder and started to speak them out. And that's where I really started to grow, because as I spoke them out and then that word got spoken out in the service and someone responded and got healed, then I began to learn that feeling of what did it feel like when God was speaking to me, the different sensations that I would get as to what he was identifying. Fast forward many, many years, then I know I can operate in that gift. Now, many times it just doesn't feel like a good timing, to be fair. In one of the roles I do here in leading our ministry school, then we would take part in healing prayers where we would be praying for the sick, and often that would involve us going out on the streets. And so I would be training people in how to listen to the word of knowledge. And I'll be very honest, in many of that seasons, I was walking through huge disappointments and unanswered prayer in my own life. And it can be very hard to kind of have that feeling of God speaking. But I knew that that gift was in me. And so it was a matter of choosing to believe and going for it. And time again, we would see through word of knowledge, people getting touched, healed, and receiving prayer and encountering God. So we have to practice that gift in us. God doesn't want us to stay static. That there's an opportunity every day for us to grow. Even if we put stuff down for a season, we can pick it up and start to grow. So with all the gifts, it's a matter of practice. And then there'll be the times of promotion, of kind of breakthrough. But practice. How do we do it? Well, there's opportunities around us all of the time. One thing I used to do many years ago, and I'm so glad as I've read books and listened to messages, many other people have done a very similar thing. As I walk down the street, I used to just ask God, okay, what color car is going to drive past me next? And again, it was kind of like a little game to myself of learning the feeling of kind of hearing him and discerning him. Because as we practice, that's why we do all these activations, is that when it comes to the moment, then we know how to hear what he's doing. Because most of the times, and certainly the stories you hear of testimonies of, people using these gifts often happen at times which is not in a ministry setting. It's on the street. It might be when you're doing your shopping, dropping your kids off at school. It's the most often inconvenient time. But as we practice, it becomes a habit. and we're lined up ready for God to use us. So we believe, we give it a go. Well, what's already inside of us? Well, as we've talked about perceiving, it's kind of taking stock of where are the gifts probably operating in us, what we might not be so aware of. Let's take, for example, word of wisdom. Are there things that just drop into you? Some things that you suddenly just know the solution of what to do about a certain problem. Well, it's taking stock and taking note of that. And maybe there's kind of recognizing that if that's God speaking through me, then having more confidence and authority, knowing that feeling. And so when we know that actually that is God speaking to him, we can apply more authority to it. And so where there are times in your life are you operating in some of the gifts? Maybe it's discerning the spirit. You might suddenly realize you have an ability to kind of, someone can be saying something, but what's really behind that? So of course we are wired to be operating in certain gifts more than others. You know, the Bible is clear about this as he talks about the body. And in that chapter in Corinthians 12 at the end, Paul says, are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers, do all work miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? Now eagerly desire the greater gifts. Now, as I've said previously, we believe that we can operate in many and even all of the gifts. What we do need to do is recognize the gifting in each other and honor and make space for those. But inside of us, we can eagerly desire and learn to operate. Now, we've got the passage here which says, are all apostles, are all prophets. Now, obviously, if you're operating in the office of prophet, you're going to be operating to a fairly high level in all the prophetic gifting. The thing about the office is the office, in that role, you are able to teach and equip the body in those giftings. So a prophet is able to really equip the body of how to hear God in the prophetic gifts. So if we are not in the office of prophet, it doesn't mean that we can't operate to a high and mature level in those gifts. And so we see in other parts of the Bible, such as in Romans 12, and Paul talking about having different gifts and, you know, operating to the grace we've been given. So if your gift is, say, in serving or in teaching or in encouraging, it doesn't mean that you can't also operate in these other spiritual gifts. You can teach, but also operate in the gift of miracles, in the gift of healing, in the words of wisdom. And so let's not just kind of box ourselves into, well, this is what I am, so I can only operate here. But we're on this journey with God who wants to manifest himself through us to build up his kingdom around us and to really encourage the body in doing that. So let's choose, let's believe, let's ask, believe and receive, perceive what we've got it, and start to recognize that gift in us and practice, practice, practice.